What if the most mysterious chapter in human history was never actually missing? What if it was simply unheard? For nearly 2,000 years, the story of Jesus Christ has shaped civilizations, inspired empires, and transformed billions of lives. His birth is celebrated. His teachings are studied. His death and resurrection stand at the center of Christian faith. But there is a gap in that story, a silence so profound, it has echoed across centuries. A silence that begins with a child. In the Gospel of Luke, we encounter Jesus at just 12 years old. He stands in the temple in Jerusalem, surrounded by learned teachers, men who had spent their entire lives studying sacred law. And yet this boy astonishes them. He listens. He questions. He answers. And those who hear him are amazed, not just at his knowledge but at his understanding. It is a moment that feels like the beginning of something extraordinary. But then, the story stops. No dramatic transition. No explanation. No record of what comes next. Just a single line. He returns home and grows. And with that, the narrative fades into silence. 18 years, unwritten, unexplained, unknown. From age 12 to 30, the life of Jesus disappears from the biblical record. No journeys are described. No miracles are recorded. No teachings are preserved. Nothing. For centuries, this gap has been called the silent years. And silence, as history has shown us, has a way of inviting questions. Where was he? What was he doing? Who was he becoming? Was he simply living an ordinary life in a small Galilean town, learning a trade, growing within his community, preparing quietly for what was to come? Or is there more to the story, something not recorded in the text that became the foundation of the Bible? Across generations, thinkers, theologians, and seekers have wrestled with these questions. Some have offered careful, grounded explanations rooted in history and culture. Others have imagined journeys, eastward, westward, into lands of philosophy and mystery. But there is one direction that has often been overlooked. So, beyond the familiar centers of early Christianity, beyond Rome and Jerusalem, beyond the narratives shaped by empire and tradition, there lies a land with one of the oldest continuous expressions of Christian faith in the world. A land where scripture was preserved in ancient tongues, where traditions were carried not just in books but in memory, where faith developed along a path both connected to and distinct from the rest of the Christian world. That land is Ethiopia. Within the traditions of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, history is not only written, it is lived. Its chants, its manuscripts, its rituals, all echo with centuries of continuity. And while it does not claim to hold a verified historical account of Jesus' missing years, it preserves something just as compelling, a different lens, a way of understanding Christ that is ancient, deeply rooted, and often unfamiliar to the Western world. Because sometimes what we call missing is not absent. It is simply preserved in forms we have not yet learned to recognize. This is not a story about proving a hidden timeline. It is a journey into history, tradition, and belief. A journey into how different cultures remember, interpret, and honor the same figure, Jesus of Nazareth. And as we begin, one question remains. Is the silence in his story empty? Or is it inviting us to listen more closely? The silence begins where certainty ends. In the Gospel of Luke, chapter 2, verses 41 to 52, we are given one of the most striking early glimpses of Jesus' life. He is 12 years old. The setting is Jerusalem, during the Passover festival, a time when the city swells with pilgrims, devotion, and expectation. Families travel long distances to participate in sacred rituals, to remember, to reconnect with God. Among them is a boy from Nazareth. At first, nothing seems unusual. He travels with his parents, Mary and Joseph, as many families did. But on the journey home, something happens. Jesus is missing. For 3 days, his parents search anxiously, through crowds, through streets, through the uncertainty that grows with every passing hour. And when they finally find him, he is not lost. He is in the temple, sitting among teachers, listening, questioning, responding. And those who hear him are amazed, not only at his answers but at the depth of his understanding. This is no ordinary child. This is a moment that feels like revelation, a glimpse of identity, a hint of purpose, a quiet unveiling of something divine. And yet, as suddenly as the moment rises, it ends. There is no continuation of this scene into adolescence. No record of further teachings. No unfolding narrative of growth into adulthood. Instead, the text closes the moment with simplicity. He returns to Nazareth and grows. And Jesus increased in wisdom and stature, and in favor with God and man. And then, nothing. No accounts of his teenage years. No descriptions of his early adulthood. No stories of travel, study, or preparation. 18 years, compressed into a single sentence. For historians, this silence is not unusual. Ancient biographies often focused only on the most significant moments of a person's life. Childhood anecdotes were rare. Daily life was considered unremarkable unless it revealed something extraordinary. From this perspective, many scholars suggest a simple explanation. Jesus lived a quiet life in Nazareth. He likely learned the trade of his earthly father, working as a craftsman, participating in his community, growing within the rhythms of Jewish tradition. A life ordinary in appearance, yet foundational in preparation. But for many that explanation feels incomplete, because the same child who astonished scholars in the temple, the same voice that spoke with authority beyond his years, disappears, and reappears nearly 2 decades later, not as a student but as a teacher, not as a learner but as one who speaks with authority. When the narrative resumes, at the banks of the Jordan River, Jesus steps into public view with clarity and purpose. There is no hesitation, no gradual emergence, only declaration, only mission. It is here that we encounter John the Baptist baptizing in the Jordan, a moment that marks the beginning of Jesus' public ministry. But the question lingers: what shaped him in those unseen years? What formed the mind that would speak in parables? The presence that would challenge authority? The compassion that would heal, restore, and transform? Was it simply time and quiet growth? Or were there influences, experiences, and traditions that were never recorded in the text that survived? This is where history ends and curiosity begins. Because when a story leaves space, people seek to fill it. Across centuries, that silence has inspired countless interpretations. Some grounded in culture, some shaped by faith, some driven by imagination. But before we explore those possibilities, we must first understand something essential. The story of Jesus did not spread in a single direction. It did not belong to one culture, one empire, or one interpretation. It moved across languages, across continents, across people who would receive it, preserve it, and understand it in different ways. And one of the earliest places where that story took root was not in Europe, but in Africa, in a kingdom that would carry the memory of Christianity in its own voice, a voice we turn to next. Long before Christianity became associated with cathedrals in Europe, before councils, creeds, and imperial power shaped its global image, the message of Christ had already begun to travel, not in one direction, not through one culture, but across many paths, quietly, steadily, and often far from the centers of empire. One of those paths led south, into Africa, into a land of highlands, ancient trade routes, and a civilization older than many of the kingdoms that would later dominate Christian history. This was the kingdom of Axum, a powerful and sophisticated empire, connected to the wider world through commerce and culture, linking Africa, the Middle East, and beyond. It was here, in the 4th century, that something remarkable happened. Christianity was not imposed by conquest. It was not introduced as a tool of empire. It was embraced. Under the reign of Izana of Axum, the kingdom officially adopted Christianity, becoming one of the earliest states in the world to do so. This moment did not mark the beginning of faith in the region, but its recognition, its rooting, its transformation into a living, enduring tradition. From this foundation emerged the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, a church that would develop its own rhythm, its own language, its own expression of devotion. Its scriptures would be written and preserved in Guizi, an ancient Semitic language. Its liturgy would be sung, not merely spoken. Its practices would reflect continuity, generation after generation, century after century. And while it remained connected to the wider Christian world, it was never fully absorbed into the theological and political systems that later shaped European Christianity. This matters, because when we think about the history of Christianity, it is often told from a narrow perspective, centered on Rome, on councils, on empires. But that is only part of the story. Christianity was never a single voice. It was, and still is, a chorus. And Ethiopia represents one of its oldest and most enduring voices. A voice that preserved traditions differently. A voice that interpreted scripture through its own cultural lens. A voice that remembered, not necessarily more, but differently. And in that difference lies something powerful. Because when a story travels across cultures, it does not remain unchanged. It is received. It is interpreted. It is lived. And in Ethiopia, the story of Christ became more than text. It became identity. Faith was not just studied, it was embodied in daily life, in ritual, in art, in community. This continuity created something rare. A tradition that feels ancient not just in age, but in presence. So when questions arise about what may have been forgotten, or overlooked, or preserved outside dominant narratives, it becomes necessary to listen to these older voices. Not because they hold secret answers hidden from the rest of the world, but because they remind us that history is larger than any single perspective. That truth is often layered. And that understanding deepens when we are willing to see beyond what is familiar. The story of Jesus did not belong to one region, and the way he was remembered was never confined to one tradition. In Ethiopia, that memory took on a life of its own. And to understand it, we must look not only at history, but at scripture itself. Because in Ethiopia, the Bible is not quite the same. If the story of Christianity spread across cultures, then its scriptures did too. But what many people don't realize is this. Not every Christian tradition preserved the exact same Bible. Across centuries, as communities grew and doctrines developed, different collections of sacred texts were accepted, debated, and defined. What we now think of as the Bible is not a single universal list. It is a canon, a carefully recognized collection of writings. And in Ethiopia, that collection took a different path. Within the tradition of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, the biblical canon is broader than what is commonly used in Western Christianity. While many are familiar with the 66-book Bible, the Ethiopian canon includes additional texts, bringing its total to a much larger collection. Among these are ancient writings such as Book of Enoch, Book of Jubilees. These are not later inventions. They are deeply rooted in early Jewish thought, circulating long before the time of Jesus and shaping the spiritual imagination of the world he was born into. In fact, echoes of the Book of Enoch can be found in the Epistle of Jude, where it is directly referenced. So why were these texts preserved in Ethiopia, but set aside elsewhere? The answer lies in history. As Christianity expanded through the Roman Empire, church leaders began defining which texts would be considered authoritative. Over time, certain writings were affirmed, while others were excluded, not always because they were unknown, but because they raised complex theological questions or were less widely used. In Ethiopia, however, the process unfolded differently. Rather than narrowing the canon in the same way, Ethiopian Christianity preserved a wider range of early writings, maintaining a broader window into the spiritual world of ancient believers. But here's the critical distinction. These texts do not provide a hidden biography of Jesus' missing years. They do not tell us where he traveled, what he studied, or who he encountered between the ages of 12 and 30. What they offer instead is context. They reveal how people of that era understood the universe, a world alive with angels and visions, a cosmos where heaven and earth were deeply intertwined, a reality where divine purpose moved through history in ways both visible and unseen. This matters because it shapes how Jesus himself was understood, not just as a teacher emerging suddenly at age 30, but as part of a much larger, ongoing story. A story already filled with expectation, prophecy, and mystery. And within this broader scriptural tradition, the idea of the divine was not distant. It was present, active, near. So when later generations told stories about Jesus, about his power, his wisdom, even his childhood, they were drawing from this rich imaginative and theological landscape, not necessarily recording history, but expressing belief. And that belief sometimes took narrative form, stories, traditions, writings that explored a simple but profound idea. If Jesus was truly divine, when did that divinity begin to show? At baptism? At birth? Or from the very beginning? This question leads us beyond canonical scripture, into another category of ancient writings, texts that were never universally accepted, but were never entirely forgotten either, because while some traditions chose to set them aside, others continued to remember. And in those memories, a different image of Jesus begins to emerge, not just as a man stepping into purpose at 30, but as a child already carrying something extraordinary. That is where we turn next. What does it mean to imagine a child who is already divine, not becoming, not growing into power, but carrying it quietly, mysteriously, from the very beginning? The canonical Gospels are careful. They give us only a single glimpse of Jesus' childhood, then step back into silence. But early Christian communities did not always leave that silence untouched. In the generations after Jesus' life, as his story spread across regions and cultures, new writings began to appear. They were not part of the official canon. They were not universally accepted. But they were read, shared, and remembered. One of the most well-known among them is the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. Unlike the Gospel accounts many are familiar with, this text focuses entirely on the early years of Jesus' life. It does not begin with a manger. It does not end with a cross. Instead, it lingers in the years the Bible leaves silent. And what it describes is a child unlike any other. In one story, a young Jesus shapes birds from clay, ordinary forms made by human hands. Then, with a word, they come to life. In another, he heals those around him, restoring what is broken with a touch that seems effortless, almost instinctive. There are moments of wisdom, moments of power, even moments that feel unsettling, where divine authority appears in ways that challenge human expectation. To modern readers, these stories can feel unfamiliar, even uncomfortable. And for many early church leaders, they were. That is why texts like the Infancy Gospel of Thomas were not included in the final biblical canon. Most scholars today agree that these writings were composed in the 2nd century or later, too distant from the life of Jesus to be considered reliable historical accounts. But dismissing them entirely would miss something important. Because these texts were never just about recording events. They were about expressing belief. They reveal how early Christians wrestled with a profound question. If Jesus was truly the Son of God, when did that identity begin? Was it revealed suddenly at baptism? Was it recognized gradually over time? Or was it always there, Present even in childhood, waiting to be seen? These stories answer that question in a very specific way. They imagine a Jesus whose divinity is not hidden until adulthood, but present from the start. A child who does not simply grow into purpose, but embodies it. And while these accounts are not considered historical evidence, they are still part of the broader Christian story, because they show us how different communities understood the same figure in different ways. Some emphasized humility and hiddenness. Others emphasized power and presence. Neither approach changes the historical silence of the missing years. But together they fill that silence with meaning, not with verified events, but with interpretation. And in some traditions, including those preserved within Ethiopian Christianity, these kinds of stories were not always pushed to the margins. They were remembered, sure, sometimes even honored as part of a wider spiritual imagination, not as confirmed history, but as reflections of faith. Because when history leaves questions unanswered, faith often responds with story. And those stories, whether literal or symbolic, tell us less about where Jesus was, and more about what people believed he was. A child, a teacher, a mystery, present from the beginning. But if these stories shape belief, who preserved them? Who carried them through centuries of change, debate, and division? To answer that, we have to leave the text behind for a moment, and travel to the places where memory itself was protected. High above the world below, in silence of a different kind. High above the plains, beyond the reach of cities and noise, there are places where time feels different. Places where history is not stored in archives alone, but lived, protected, and passed down. In the highlands of Ethiopia, monasteries cling to mountainsides, some carved into rock, some hidden behind cliffs, some reachable only by foot or by faith. For centuries, these have been centers of devotion within the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. Not just places of prayer, but places of preservation. Here, monks became more than spiritual guides. They became guardians of memory. Manuscripts were not printed. They were written by hand, line by line, page by page, generation after generation. Ink on parchment, carefully copied, carefully protected. Many of these texts were written in Guizi, an ancient language no longer spoken in daily life, but still alive in liturgy and scripture. To read them is not just to access information. It is to step into continuity. Some of these manuscripts are among the oldest surviving Christian texts in the world. They carry the Gospels. They preserve hymns. They include writings that other traditions set aside. But here is the important truth. There is no verified manuscript among them that reveals a hidden historical account of Jesus' missing years. No secret record. No lost biography waiting to be uncovered. And yet, that does not diminish their significance. Because what these monasteries preserved is something deeper than a missing chapter. They preserved a way of remembering. In many parts of the world, history passed through disruption, through conquest, translation, reinterpretation. But in Ethiopia, there has been remarkable continuity. Not perfect, not untouched, but enduring. Traditions were not just written down. They were practiced, chanted, painted, lived. In illuminated manuscripts, Jesus is often depicted not only as a teacher or a suffering figure, but as radiant, present with divine authority. Even in scenes of his youth, the emphasis is clear. This is no ordinary life. These images are not historical documentation. They are theological expression. Visual statements of belief. They tell us how communities understood Christ, not only through words, but through art, rhythm, and ritual. And in these spaces, removed from the pressures that shaped other centers of Christianity, those expressions were preserved with unusual stability. This is why Ethiopia matters in this conversation. Not because it holds a hidden timeline of Jesus' life, but because it holds a continuity of faith that developed along its own path. A path that remembers differently. A path that values not only what was written, but how it was lived. Because memory is not always about recording every detail. Sometimes, it is about preserving meaning, holding on to identity, carrying forward what matters most. So when we ask, where were the missing years of Jesus? These monasteries do not give us a location. They give us something else. A reminder that not all truth is preserved as data. Some of it is preserved as tradition, as interpretation, as presence. And in Ethiopia, that presence has endured, quietly, consistently, for centuries. But beyond manuscripts and monasteries, there are also stories. Stories not written as history, but held as identity. Stories that connect Ethiopia not just to early Christianity, but to the very foundations of the biblical world itself. To understand that connection, we have to look at one of the most enduring traditions of all. Not everything that shapes a tradition is written as history. Some of the most powerful beliefs are carried through story, told, retold, and woven into the identity of a people. In Ethiopia, one such story stands at the center of its spiritual imagination. It is a story of kings, of lineage, of a connection that reaches back to the very roots of the Bible. According to the Kabra Nagast, a revered Ethiopian text compiled centuries ago, the connection begins with two figures known across the world, King Solomon and Queen of Sheba. Their meeting is described in the Bible as a moment of wisdom and exchange. But Ethiopian tradition tells a continuation of that story. It speaks of a son, Menelik, a child of royal lineage born from that encounter. And according to this tradition, Menelik would one day travel to Jerusalem and return not alone. He would bring with him one of the most sacred objects in biblical history, the Ark of the Covenant. The same Ark said to have held the tablets of the Ten Commandments. The same Ark described as a symbol of God's presence among his people. In Ethiopian belief, this Ark now resides in the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion, guarded, protected, never displayed publicly, watched over by a single monk, chosen for life, devoted entirely to its care. No one else is permitted to see it. Not historians, not archaeologists, not even religious authorities beyond its guardian. From a modern historical perspective, there is no verifiable evidence confirming this claim. No excavation has confirmed it. No independent documentation proves it. And yet, the story endures. Not as a footnote, but as a foundation. Because its importance is not limited to whether it can be proven. Its importance lies in what it represents. It places Ethiopia within the story of the Bible, not at the margins but at the center. Not as a distant observer, but as a participant in sacred history. It creates a sense of continuity, linking ancient Israel, early Christianity, and Ethiopian identity into one unbroken narrative. And within that narrative, the story of Jesus is not something foreign or imported. It belongs. It fits into a larger, ongoing relationship between the divine and the people who carry that memory. This is why traditions like this matter in our exploration. Not because they provide a missing historical record of Jesus' early life, but because they shape how his life is understood. In a tradition that sees itself as deeply connected to the origins of biblical faith, Jesus is not simply a figure who appears in history. He is part of a much longer story. A story that stretches back through prophecy, kingship, covenant, and divine presence. So when Ethiopian Christianity reflects on Jesus, it does so within a framework that is already rich with meaning. A framework where the sacred is near, where history and faith are intertwined, where identity is built not only on what can be proven, but on what is believed, preserved, and lived. And this brings us back to the question at the heart of our journey. If the missing years of Jesus are not historically recorded, why do so many traditions feel as though something important happened during that time? Why do stories emerge across cultures trying to fill that silence? To answer that, we must step back one final time, and look not at what is written, or even what is remembered, but at what the silence itself might mean. After all the questions, after the manuscripts, the traditions, the stories, and the search, we return to the same place we began. Silence. The gap between 12 and 30 remains, unwritten, unconfirmed, unresolved. There is no hidden manuscript in Ethiopia that fills it with historical detail. No verified account that maps out where Jesus traveled or what he did. History, in its strictest sense, leaves that space empty. And yet, that emptiness has never truly been empty, because across centuries, people have responded to that silence in different ways. Some, through careful study, looking to context, culture, and the everyday life of first-century Judea to understand what is most likely. Others, through tradition, preserving stories, texts, and interpretations that explore who Jesus might have been before his public ministry. And in places like Ethiopia, within the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, that response took a unique form, not by claiming a lost timeline, but by preserving a broader spiritual vision. A vision shaped by texts like the Book of Enoch, by traditions carried through centuries, and by a continuity of faith that remembers differently. Because perhaps the question is not only, where was Jesus during those years? But also, why does the silence exist at all? In ancient storytelling, silence was not always accidental. Writers focused on what they believed mattered most. The Gospels do not attempt to record every moment of Jesus' life. They are not full biographies. They are testimonies. They begin where the message begins. They focus where the mission becomes clear. From this perspective, the silence is not a missing piece of history. It is a deliberate absence, an invitation, an opening left for reflection. Because what defines Jesus in the gospel narrative is not where he studied, or how he spent every year of his youth. It is what he revealed, his teachings, his actions, his identity. And yet, the human mind resists unanswered questions. We want the full story. We want to trace every step, understand every influence, uncover every hidden detail. So we search, across continents, across traditions, across texts both accepted and rejected. And in that search we discover something unexpected. Not answers, but perspectives. Different ways of seeing the same figure. Different voices remembering the same life. Ethiopia does not give us a missing chapter of Jesus' biography. but it gives us something just as valuable, a reminder that Christianity is larger than a single narrative, that its history is not confined to one region or one interpretation, that its memory lives in many places, carried by many people, expressed in many forms, and maybe that is the deeper truth hidden within the silence, that not everything needs to be filled in, that some spaces are meant to remain open, so that each generation can ask, seek, and reflect. Because in the end, the mystery of those years may never be fully solved, but the impact of the life that followed them is undeniable, and perhaps that is the point. The silence does not diminish the story, it deepens it. If this journey made you rethink what you know about history, faith, and the story of Jesus, subscribe for more explorations into ancient traditions, hidden histories, and untold perspectives. Like the video, share it with someone who loves deep questions, and drop your thoughts in the comments. Do you think the missing years of Jesus were simply ordinary? Or do you believe there's more beneath the surface? Because sometimes, the greatest mysteries in history are not the ones we solve, but the ones that keep us searching.